Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Kushel.
A lot of different, several different events and stories going on within the last week since the last time we recorded that we'd like to get into during the course of this show, as well as perhaps more in the second half of the show, more a bigger picture analysis tying a few things together. But I guess, Jeremy, we'd like to start with news that just broke this morning. A very interesting New York Times Intercept report that I think is very much stirred up a lot of emotions within the what we might call the anti-war left, what we might call the left in general, as far as various factions who within this more and more of what we're identifying as a geopolitical divide, a geopolitical split among a portion of the left, you might say a portion that is more within the Intercept Democracy Now! Sphere of influence, and then we have the more, Russia-centric, you might call it anti-imperialist sector. And this report is very interesting New York. The root of this is a very interesting New York Times Intercept report on Iranian influence in Iraq, and just that alone is able to, I think, let people know that there's a lot of emotion involved in this. And so, Jeremy, I know we've talked about this among ourselves. You've been thinking a lot about it. What would you say are your initial thoughts on this story in general, and then maybe we can get into some of the some other facets, of course, including the very interesting classification of the Iraq War as a blunder as well. That's something else needs to be taken into consideration.
Well, yes, and the reporting, we should first report that the reporting has to do with some alleged to have been leaked Iranian intelligence documents about how Iran and Iranian intelligence has operated within Iraq to perpetuate their influence there and to grow their influence intensely, of course, in the post-Iraq war period. And we may want to just couple this with another New York Times-based leak, quote-unquote, leak story out of China that is also apparently based on an insider leaking documents about the actual statements from inside the highest levels of the Chinese government, including Xi Jinping, in relationship to the Uighur Muslims and how to approach them and their crackdown and their cultural re-education, so-called, and all of that. And so it's an interesting moment to both deal with the facts of the matter here, what's being reported, what that means, while also considering what the bigger picture is, how maybe the meta-analysis of how we might deal with these kinds of stories about the quote-unquote nemesis or enemies of our U.S. context, our alleged U.S. empire context here, and so we at the Antidote, we like to first and foremost start from the principle of the truth, and the whole truth and nothing but the truth as best we can ascertain it, and that is the foundational principle of a politics that can be then built on top of that. That includes in other principles, but that's the basis of it. And so we work to not be stuck in camps, political camps, or boxes that people want to define for us in order for us to give our take properly. So we want to start with the facts of the matter. And so this is interesting. This joint Intercept New York Times reporting, that is the title of which is The Iran Cables, quote, leaked Iranian intelligence reports expose Tehran's vast web of influence in Iraq, with a combination of reporting from James Risen, Tim Arango, Farnaz Fasihi, Murtaza Hussein, and Ronan Bergman.
And I'll mention that it was the featuring of Ronan Bergman in this article that appears to have gotten a lot of flack, perhaps rightly so in a lot of ways, from what we've identified maybe as the more, more, I don't know if Russia-centric is the proper term for it, but that's the term we're going to use right now of this element within the anti-war, anti-imperialist left, as Ronan Bergman has written a book about Iran being a top security threat, and among other things. So Ronan Bergman's involvement in this story has gotten a lot of scrutiny, and I guess has given cause to dismiss this report easier than perhaps otherwise.
Right, and so it's definitely the case that Ronan Bergman is obviously, he's, a national security insider Israeli journalist who has access to the Israeli intelligence community. In many ways, he looks like he's, top 3 in terms of Israeli journalists with access in terms of the Israeli intelligence community. So I think that's unabashed. He's definitely been involved in some of the anti-Iran propaganda / journalism that's gone on, and so that's been definitely jumped on, and it should be attended to. And we should then also maybe just read through some of the titles here of these different stories that are being reported from these series of leaks, and then because I haven't actually read through much of this at all yet, I just heard it on the radio on Democracy Now! Being reported upon, and I believe it was Murtaza Hussein who was on Democracy Now! This morning, who seemed to be reporting on this in a fair fashion to me in terms of the way he was talking about it. He was like that this is not, doesn't paint Iranian intelligence really in a bad light per se. It shows them to be a professional, dedicated intelligence service that is working to perpetuate the national interests that are perceived by the Iranian government.
Yes, and Murtaza Hussein, and I haven't read through this article yet, just for clarification, has written one solely, he had sole credit for one of the, I guess you call them supplemental articles to go along with the bigger article that we just mentioned, also published on the Intercept as of this morning, titled Iran's Shadow War on ISIS. While U.S.-led forces dropped bombs, Iran waged its own covert campaign against the Islamic State. And this article is asserting that basically how the U.S. and Iran became allies against ISIS. That is certainly a very interesting and very provocative title that was for an article as a supplemental, I guess you might call it, or a partner article to the bigger article with James Risen, Murtaza Hussein, and Ronan Bergman, among others.
Yes, and it looks like that the Iranian intelligence was actually upset that the U.S. was not willing to actually more directly collaborate with them or in relationship to fighting ISIS, which is interesting, too, in terms of the U.S.-Russia, at the very least, deconflicting, and there's definitely some aspect where the U.S. and Russia decided to communicate at the command level, military command structure in relationship to ISIS in Syria. So it is interesting that you can imagine that Iranian intelligence would want to work with the U.S. in terms of the common ISIS threat. And then what's interesting. Then there's another article by James Risen specifically that's titled, quote, Iran's Quds Force and the Muslim Brotherhood considered an alliance against Saudi Arabia. So that's interesting. There's another little piece there in terms of the relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. It's sort of the other side from what we've been reporting on in terms of the Saudi-Israeli and the more widespread Saudi Arab, basically New Arab Legion alliance against Iran, and so this sort of reports a little bit from within the more Arab Muslim world that Iran was seeking, at least the Quds Force was seeking, an alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood against Saudi Arabia. So that's interesting. And then I'll just read another title here. Quote, from the rubble of the U.S. war in Iraq, Iran built a new order, unquote, by Jeremy Scahill and Murtaza Hussein. And part of the reason, and justly so, I think that the framing of this is being attacked by people who are anti-war and anti-imperialist is because the entire thing, as you said, is being framed as a as a strategic error, or the Iraq War was a strategic error or blunder of the U.S. national security state, rather than a war crime, aggressive warfare, crimes against humanity. And I would just point out that I think that both of these are true at the same time, and they should be pointed out to be true at the same time. And that it is very obvious that the United States did commit the supreme act, a crime against international law, which is aggressive warfare. And then all of the crimes that then cascade from there, including the hundreds of thousands of lives dead, probably millions of lives dead if you include the entirety of the larger war on terror. And then if you consider the fallout, in many ways, the disruption of the destruction of the nation, then it's the negative effect is millions and millions and millions and millions of human lives. And so that does need to be frontally dealt with. And so I completely agree with that. To frame it as just a strategic blunder is at best an egocentric and immoral framing of crimes against humanity. So that's clearly the case, I'd say. And at the same time, it was obviously also it could be seen as a strategic blunder in relationship to the United States, even as an empire as such, with its own, alleged national interests in mind here, in terms of the amount of, as the imperialists call it, quote unquote, blood and treasure that have been invested in this, and what has been supposedly reaping the rewards of it. Because the old school of empire and colonization is that you plunder, you reap rewards from, and of course that was why Donald Trump was appealing to some aspect of the Alex Jones. That's how Alex Jones sort of ran cover for him. I remember when I called in to the show during the campaign, and he was like, Trump was just on your show, Alex, and he was calling for grabbing the oil and grabbing the materials in Afghanistan. Is that what we really want? We want to go from like a real anti-war perspective to basically, if we're going to do, war crimes, let's at least grab the resources. And he's like, well, he just has to say that, he's just trying to appeal. He's like, we're already there, so why don't we just go ahead and
treat the resource, you treat it like you treat, I guess, the female anatomy.
Good point, Greg. And so, yeah. And so there's that aspect of it, that there is this question of what is the imperial reason for this. It does look to be like a strategic blunder from the U.S. perspective. And then at the same time, as we've been pointing out over and over and over again over the entirety basically of the Trump administration, that to call the Iraq War a strategic blunder is to ignore the policy dimensions behind some of the people who actually architected the thing, which includes this small group of neoconservatives, Israeli firsters, many of them, that architected the clean break program, certain people in the Israeli government, the Netanyahus, the Ariel Sharons. And you and I, Greg, were talking earlier about how it's very possible that someone like an Israeli intelligence insider like Ronen Bergman very possibly represents a part of the Israeli intelligence services that were against the Iraq War, specifically because they said that and knew that it was going to destabilize the region. And so those were the anti-clean breakers. We had them inside of the Israeli national security set, and they were inside of the U.S. national security set. But this much more transnational group was much more focused, and obviously they were able to accomplish their goals and to accomplish what they were actually trying to do in terms of what's architected in the clean break paper, right? The overthrow in Iraq, the rolling back in Syria, and then even darker, that the more covert aspects of this is that the destabilization of Iraq looks to have been continued, not just in terms of the U.S. assault on Iraq, but also in terms of the sniping, including the sniping we've talked about at U.S. Marines by Juba the Sniper, and the questions about Israeli kits that were apparently involved in that. And then also the question of the liquidation of the cultural and professional architecture in Iraq. That was done on purpose. And then we definitely have to come back to who was in charge, right, of the Coalition Provisional Authority, Paul Bremer. And he ultimately was the one who made the decision to dissolve the Iraqi nation, okay? And so, yes, one way of looking at this would be, oh, wow, he really blundered. He really blundered, and it caused a mass chaos. And in the midst of this blunder, Iran, which anyone could have seen coming, stepped into the void. It's their neighbor. Of course, they're going to step into the void and make apply their own influence there. It's a heavily Shia country. Of course, they're going to be involved there. So anyone could have seen it coming. And so then it's from the perspective of the U.S. empire, it looks like a blunder. But meanwhile, is there a larger geopolitical global architecture to who it is that is actually potentially organizing this post 9/11 world?
Great points, all those, and it seems to me that something that neither what we've very much been among ourselves discussing this kind of this factional this split on the left as relates to this reporting and the writing with the aforementioned factions. It's interesting that Murtaza Hussein pops up in this because he had a very public spat with Max Blumenthal over Syria as a part of Blumenthal shifting away, and I guess his breaking of relations with some of his former allies on the whole, within the pro-Palestinian left. But I think something that neither of these groupings will really go to, whether they call the Iraq War a strategic blunder, whether they call it a massive war crime, I don't think that there's a lot of factors regarding the construction of it that very, very provable facts about the architecture of the Iraq War that I don't think either side's willing to take into consideration, because the entire focus of those who wanted to say the Iraq War was planned from the beginning go back to the whole oil thing. Bush had oil fields on his oil field maps on his desk from the day he was inaugurated. This was all just the greedy war for oil that Cheney and others of his ilk wanted. And we see an aversion to talking about a very obvious and very provable Israeli preeminent factor in the lead up to the Iraq War. I mean, we saw that publicly we saw that firsthand during the screening of the film Official Secrets about UK whistleblower Catherine Gunn, where the director mentioned Abram Shulsky and the Office for Special Plans, and Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies, who was hosting this screenings, did not seem very comfortable with the name with OSP and Abram Shulsky being mentioned. So I think this is
and which is just one point. It's very interesting that she would be so uncomfortable with it. Like we saw that she seemed very wary about people just mentioning. We were mentioning it from the audience. Well, didn't you forget about Israel? But the ISP, or IPS, Institute for Policy Studies, her organization, has published documents specifically about Israeli involvement in the OSP and all of that. So then it makes you wonder, okay, what is her role as the public head of it all?
Sure, and I think that this Israeli factor, what we call when we dug into war for oil for Israel, based on the findings of Gary Vogler in his book, and some details that came out there about the very specific role of Israeli partisans such as the Makovsky brothers and others. This is, I think,
He doesn't talk about the Makovsky brothers. He talks about specifically about Michael Makovsky, who ends up as the head of JINSA, who had been put in against the Pentagon security desires at the head of the Pentagon and overlooking Iraqi oil policy after the fact via people like what he labels as the Israel Lobby and Douglas Feith.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. I'm glad I knew it was one of the Makovsky brothers. I couldn't figure out which one, so I incorrectly mentioned the brothers as a duo, and I shouldn't have done that. But
by the way, one last thing on this Michael Makovsky reference that is also filled in now by Gary Vogler in his book Iraq and the Politics of Oil: An Insider's Perspective, is that his U.S. intelligence people informed him that the background of Michael Makovsky in the Israeli foreign services for at least 5 years, it looks like, is basically almost a guarantee. They say 98% chance that makes Michael Makovsky an agent of Israeli intelligence inserted into the highest levels of the Pentagon post-Iraq war.
That certainly sounds believable and almost natural for someone like him to me. But I guess with the risk of sounding too or being too ranty or being too heavy-winded in terms of discussing this, I'll just make my point that I think both of these left factions that we've discussed, I think that's one of their Achilles heels, one of their biggest ones, is an inability to or unwillingness to acknowledge the very real Israeli, not only as a factor, but the leading factor, certainly from within the Bush administration and within the propaganda circles, of pushing for the war in Iraq. So it was not a strategic blunder as was being classified or as being described as now. But what you brought up about Iran and the filling of the Iranian void and the geopolitical aspects of that, it brings up another very interesting dynamic. I think we've discussed this before, as far as the role of what's called the multipolar world in September 11th, and that comes into the role of the possible benefit that countries such as Russia and China would receive from the September 11th attacks, and how that could relate to Iranian influence in Iraq.
Yes, and this very much, I think this just adds a little bit more detail here. Both the story about Iranian intelligence and the China story about the treatment of the Uyghurs, specifically about what we've been dissecting and attempting to clarify in terms of this 9/11, post 9/11 world order that the so-called enemies or nemesis of the United States, i.e. China and Russia, and that's a big move now, especially it's sort of become front and center during the Trump administration, is that we're not post-war on terror from a U.S. perspective, but the war on terror is now, from a Pentagon, specifically military perspective, is put into the second tier behind the great powers competition, which is seeing the U.S. As the competitor with Russia and China. And so, but in the midst of all of this is this missing analysis about September 11th and who did it and why. And is this great power competition really just the next generation of something like the Cold War, which in many ways I see as synthetically generated in a way that facilitates global collusion towards authoritarian structures, towards the interface of authoritarian intelligence networks, and then increasingly in the post 9/11 world and in the digital era of the techno-tyranny, of the surveillance society. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And meanwhile, there's another story that recently came out about how Russia is in the midst of installing one of the most severe facial recognition biometric systems in the world. So when you piece all of this together, we've seen what's happened in the post 9/11 United States. We got an entirely new Department of Homeland Security. We have the spread of the fusion centers. We have the police departments now being harmonized per se into the federal apparatus. We have the fusion centers actually working to create suspicious activity reports based sometimes on completely constitutionally protected activity like speech and press. And then also the training of police at the highest levels, the command level in Israel. The distribution of military gear under the 1033 program to the police departments around the country, just escalating the authoritarian aspects of the war on drugs, so-called. And so that we see a lot of that, and also the escalation behind the scenes of the surveillance society and the techno-tyranny. And of course, we've talked about this before briefly, that there was a sidestepped or a runaround in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, when I believe it was John Negroponte who had proposed the Total Information Agency with the all-seeing eye on top of the pyramid as the logo and all of that. And that was too frontal, so they backed away from that. And then in the years after that, in the wake after that, up come the big digital. Google had already been created. It hadn't quite yet really, created itself as the controller of all information on planet Earth as it sort of aspires to be now, and is seen as the leading data company worldwide. But then also, of course, the rest of the data companies that are under guise of social media, i.e. mainly Facebook is sort of the most obvious one, but also Twitter, of course. And so then Facebook ultimately becomes the way for people to opt in for their surveillance under the guise of a corporate free gift of a social media platform that everyone can then do and reconnect with their high school and college friends, and be able to share pictures of their children and playing and all of that, and then also the activists drawn into sharing news stories. And then we've also seen how that has obviously been weaponized. And we don't even know quite how deeply the weaponization of all of that has gone. So that's just from the U.S. context in terms of what we've seen from the post 9/11 effects just domestically. And we've then also obviously seeing this similarly in relationship to what I just referenced about the stories of Russia creating a massive surveillance facial recognition grid, China doing so. And so I just wanted to point that out, that the other flip side of that is the geostrategics of this, the geopolitics in relationship to the post 9/11 aggressive war policy run out of the United States of America as the main perpetrator of that. But also remember, we're the recipient of the 9/11 attacks. So then I think it's very, very crucial that we further analyze this to understand how the continuity of something like a Cold War that is synthetic at some level has been regenerated in the 21st century under the terror umbrella, including digital technology, and that we, the people, not only the United States of America, we clearly have a key role to play here. And I would say the idea of a proactive approach to principled American leadership is something we have to take on. We are a powerful country, and we have to act like we are powerful people in this country. And we need to take the narrative and moral lead here away from the criminals who have used our government to do unspeakable crimes against not only American people, millions of people in jails, all the people under assault from the selling out of our food supply, the air, the water, all that. But of course, the people who caught the brunt of the post 9/11 response, in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and North Africa, and increasingly all around the world. So this is a time for we the people, both here at home in the United States of America and increasingly to understand a we the people approach worldwide to international politics. So it's not an either or. We need to be involved internationally while also strengthening our national principles here at home. And so this is a moment, I believe, to do that. And so I just want to wrap up by pointing at the basics of this article about the leaked documents out of China's Xinjiang detentions. And of course, in the midst of all of this is difficult because just like September 11th, it was obvious even to me when I was not clear about who did it and why, and when I was, in the hills of southern Vermont and barely able to get, didn't have internet, every so often could get bits of a Pacifica affiliate and hear Democracy Now! and or a Noam Chomsky lecture. And both Chomsky and Amy Goodman both failed to even hint at that there was an alternative aspect to who did September 11th and why. But even then, it was so obvious to me that 9/11 was being used as propaganda, right? And so we have to both be able to say that we know that these kind of, these leaks and these mass media stories about the alleged enemies of the United States, including China and Russia, are going to be used for propaganda, both at home and abroad, meaning both geopolitically in terms of the great power competition push to, recatalyze the military-industrial complex, but also in terms of the domestic response at home to justify, well, this is what great powers do in relationship to the internal threats. It's just sort of an accepted thing around the world as you create a total surveillance society. So that is the sort of danger here. But in the midst of that, September 11th did happen. So the most important thing was not to wring our hands about some people are going to use it for propaganda. The most important thing remains that we analyze who did it and why, and then how are we going to hold them to account, and then how are we going to take the moral and narrative lead politically away from them and propose something much better than what they're bringing to the table. So I'm just, from the Guardian reporting on this New York Times, the title is "Show No Mercy. Leaked documents reveal the details of China's Xinjiang detentions. More than 400 pages leaked to New York Times by Chinese political insider document brutal crackdown on Muslim minority." I'm just going to read a few paragraphs so people get a sense of what's in here. And there's a picture of barbed wire fence and a pretty stark compound that looks like maybe a prison complex in Chicago or something like that. More than 1 million people are thought to be interned in, quote, re-education, unquote, camps in the Chinese province of Xinjiang. Quote, hundreds of pages of leaked internal government documents reveal how China's mass detention of Uyghurs and other minorities in Xinjiang came from directives by Chinese leader Xi Jinping to, quote, show absolutely no mercy, unquote, in the, quote, struggle against terrorism, infiltration, and separatism, unquote. More than 400 pages of documents obtained by the New York Times show that the government was aware its campaign of mass internment would tear families apart and could provoke backlash if it became widely known. Beijing has repeatedly refuted criticisms of its crackdown in the predominantly Muslim region, which has seen more than 1 million Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other minorities sent to camps where they are often subjected to political indoctrination. China has organized tours of the camp, which it describes as voluntary, quote, vocational training centers, unquote, intended to provide, quote, students, unquote, with job skills. The documents leaked by a member of the Chinese political establishment who hoped to prevent Xi and other leaders, the ruling Chinese Communist Party, from escaping responsibility contradict those claims. That person requested anonymity, according to the New York Times. According to the report, Xi first called for the crackdown in a series of private speeches given to officials during and after a visit to Xinjiang in 2014, weeks after Uighur militants had attacked a train station, stabbing and killing 31 people. Quote, "We must be as harsh as them," unquote, Xi said, adding, quote, "and show absolutely no mercy," unquote. In the speeches, Xi did not explicitly order the creation of a large network of camps, but called for the party to use the, quote, "organs of dictatorship," unquote, to deal with extremism. And then final paragraph here. Other documents showed that officials looked at the UK as a cautionary tale of a government placing, quote, "human rights above security." Instead, Xi encouraged officials to follow aspects of the U.S., quote, "war on terror," unquote, following the September 11th attacks, unquote. And there's more to the story, and we'll link to it. And, you know, just to be fair, there was other parts of these documents that showed Xi saying that he did not want this to be thought of as a way of condemning Islam in general, and that was a bad path to go. And so it does sound very much like the neoconservatives, the paleo neocons approach to the war on terror. To me, we're not against Islam in general. We're against those militants, Uyghurs there. And I just want to point two things out really quickly, is to remind people of the last big story that came out in relationship to the Xinjiang province in relationship to surveillance technology. I talked about it on one of our shows about how the person reporting on it on Democracy Now! Specifically said that the reason that Xinjiang was so important and the main reason for this crackdown was not the terrorist threat, so-called, and we should then go look into the question of false flag terrorism in a Chinese context, as we've looked into it in the U.S. and Russian context, but that the reason for it was actually that this was the key Chinese province in relationship to the extension of the Belt Road Initiative. So that this was actually about the Belt Road Initiative most intensely, and smoothing that from the east to its west. So that's one thing. And I pointed out at that time that it appeared that Amy Goodman was ignoring that key point that was being made by the journalist and or human rights activist. And then the second thing I want to point out is, once again, Erik Prince, right at the epicenter of this.
Yes.
This tragedy and these crimes, just like he was at the epicenter of crimes in the Middle East, his Frontier Services Group, I believe is the one, was involved in training and facilitation in relationship to these camps, I believe.
Yes, and I want to address this for a couple minutes here. I don't want to be too long, so we can move on. I think we've got another topic we want to discuss, but I want to follow up on this. Excuse me, what you said here about this breakdown of this article and of China. And it's interesting that you mentioned that you threw out, I think rightly so, the caveat of Xi's language that we don't want this to appear like it's targeting Muslims or Islam in general, and how it's very similar to the elements of the Bush administration that were influencing a lot of speeches. I mean, of the administration in terms of the benevolent war on terror, where we're not trying to wage war against Islam in general. We're trying to bring freedom to these oppressed peoples and all this and that, quote unquote. But this it's interesting that Erik Prince is so central to this, and Erik Prince is directly. There are very few more blatant examples of Erik Prince, who has personally spoken of the war on terror as I believe he's personally called it a new crusade. And that's obviously religious-based language, evoking memories of the original crusades of the Christian-Muslim battle for the Holy Land back in the Middle Ages. And so it's interesting that one of the international, I guess, architects of this policy, of these tactics, is Erik Prince, who very much is in line with very few more blatant examples of this idea of a global war, not only terrorism, but of a religious war against against the infidels, our ancient enemies, it seems. And so on that note, that's something that people like you pointed out to me, Samira Khan, just completely blanketly dismissing this reporting because it was from the New York Times and pointing out the New York Times faulty. They're reporting on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. This is proof, we can't take this seriously. But, I pointed out also that if this was a New York Times classified report on documents coming out of some anti-climate change think tank claiming that climate change is a hoax, then I think these people would be all for it. But that aside, this Erik Prince dynamic and this very real relationship between the right wing in the U.S. and the Chinese that I think very much there's still some things to figure out regarding the nature of the China protest and what the goals are of the U.S. Trump administration, the American right in general as it relates to China policy. But the very real involvement of people like Erik Prince in this whole saga is something that these those who just want to dismiss this as being just propaganda and untrue and look at the source and the source lies, so the source is going to lie about this. This is something I think that they need to deal with.
I agree. And so in our last little bit less than 20 minutes here, let's switch back to what looks like a more domestic concern here in terms of the ongoing impeachment process, Roger Stone's conviction. But I would then point out that this is where a lot of this, the center or the epicenter of some of these activities that are really being looked into, once again, are in Ukraine and are very much related to Russian influence, Putin. And so I want us to dig into that, and we won't have the time to really flesh out what I think we really need to do is go back to the Maidan Square and the sniper incidents and really analyze that again from a more complex geopolitical analysis and really thinking about hybrid warfare and who was doing this, who was being served. But for now, let's just drill down a little bit on these main players here and what is being discussed in Washington, D.C., and once again, what's being left out of the equation. And of course, at the epicenter of this, like I said, is Ukraine. So there's people who are testifying, such as Marie Yovanovitch, who is the former ambassador in Ukraine, and there during some key years. And then more recently, Bill Taylor, who comes from a military background and then has been involved in the Foreign Service and State Department diplomacy for a few decades now. He took over as the charge, I guess, in charge of the U.S. Embassy mission in Ukraine. And I find it very interesting, as we'll link to it too, but Bill Taylor has been in Ukraine before, and he actually is the U.S. State Department official who there's a document that was released by WikiLeaks, interestingly enough, that talks, it's Bill Taylor's commentary on Dmytro Firtash, is the key Ukrainian oligarch in a lot of these contexts. And I don't believe his name is yet to be mentioned in the midst of these impeachment hearings, at least the public ones. And but everybody involved knows that this is in the background there. And so I just want to put a few things onto the table around that, because of course, who else was involved in Ukraine before Rudy Giuliani, right, who was there, but Paul Manafort. And so we've found some interesting Twitter threads that link to articles reporting on U.S. Officials and nationals' involvement with Dmytro Firtash, who is labeled by Bill Taylor in these documents as having said that he had to. It sounds like he had to get permission from Semyon Mogilevich in relationship to his decisions as a mass billionaire in Ukraine around making natural gas business decisions. So
yes, and I'd like to quickly here. I'd just like to mention. I think this ties into what we're talking about here. this morning, for the first time ever, I called into Lee Stranahan's program, or the program on Sputnik hosted by Lee Stranahan and Garland Nixon, Fault Lines. We've been very critical of Lee Stranahan for numerous reasons, and one of the reasons is that I think Lee Stranahan, definitely in his role as being a semi, I guess, provocateur through his platform on Sputnik against, Zionism in Israel, particularly his relationship with Breitbart. Of course, he was old friends with Andrew Breitbart and was a writer there for several years. I called in this morning about him having Jim Hoft of the Gateway Pundit as a semi-regular guest on his program. I mentioned Jim Hoft being photographed with Andrew Breitbart and Benjamin Netanyahu in the infamous 2007 photo that was the inspiration for Breitbart. And then Lee Stranahan cut me off from there and basically said that his reasoning is that Jim Hoft and also Alex Jones, while he doesn't agree with everything they promote, give him a platform still and also will publish things that Breitbart won't publish. And I think that this on its face sounds like a good explanation for, a justifiable reason, although we've talked among ourselves. I'm not going to get into it right now about the issues even with that of thank you for promoting me. Now I'm going to give you a platform and all that your website represents. But it made me wonder what number one, what are the motivations of a site like Gateway Pundit that's so obviously Zionist and one of the bigger Zionist propaganda outlets there are in terms of extremity of talking points. What is the interest of Gateway Pundit to publish articles that are favorable to protecting this narrative of the bigger, Russian international crime syndicate that's so involved in all of this? And that is something I think that where these interests, particularly of the Russian and the Israeli angles, come together, where someone like Lee Stranahan is not giving a whole lot of any insight on, actually, and that is running cover for this bigger operation that I think protects both the Israeli interests as well as the Russian interests. So I just wanted to point that out in relation to my call this morning into Sputnik and Lee Stranahan.
Okay, and I would like for us to eventually really follow up by digging in further to this question of how much the alternative media is really patterned by aspects of Russian active measures. For a long time, it was so clear that there was limited hangouts, there were domestic agents in place, and especially relationship to things like foundation funding of alternative media, definitely Israeli agents in place and limiting the narrative around the topics about Jewish state power, most obviously. But then more and more, there's these large sort of swaths of the alternative media that so obviously fit in, and it's none more obvious than when they're actually being paid and on the platform of Russian state media, such as Lee Stranahan on Sputnik Radio, of course. But it goes beyond that, and people pick that up, these narratives up, and it really gets spread in many ways. And so I think the most important thing for us to do is to really go at this information from, as best we can muster, a sense of first principles, of looking freshly at the array of facts, and so that we're not just reacting to reactions. And so thank you for bringing that up, Greg. And I just wanted to quickly point out a few of the threads that we found. There's an interesting Jay McKenzie Twitter thread from back in 2017, actually, pointing out all the star lawyers, the all-star legal team, including former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff, are defending Firtash, and that's from a Chicago Tribune story. But then there's another interesting story from Eurozine, the Firtash octopus, that, quote, Chertoff was recruited as Firtash's defense lawyer by Paul Manafort. And so also in that article, quote, however, while Lanny Davis openly acts as Firtash's public lobbyist, some of his U.S. lawyers have not declared the oligarch as their client. Another influential lawyer, Michael Chertoff, former Secretary of Homeland Security in the second administration of George W. Bush, is a case in point. Chertoff was recruited as Firtash's defense lawyer by Paul Manafort, an American political consultant who had spent over 10 years helping the Party of Regions and Viktor Yanukovych stay in power. While working for Yanukovych, Manafort was in frequent contact with his chief of staff, Sergei Lavochkin, who in turn is Firtash's political and business associate. Manafort has not only played a key role in devising Firtash's defense against the U.S. lawsuit, he has also helped Firtash acquire property in the United States. In 2008, the oligarch's company started to negotiate a $885 million acquisition of land in New York on which the Drake Hotel is located, with the idea of building a 65-story Bulgari tower on the site. However, this was not to be. Okay. Unquote. So I just want to include a lot of these Twitter threads from folks who have been analyzing the question of Manafort and Firtash, because this is another damning aspect of what's not going to be talked about. Apparently, from the U.S. Congress all the way to the Alex Joneses and the Lee Stranahans, is who is Dmytro Firtash, what's his relationship with Paul Manafort. Even from the Mueller investigation, we saw things like Lucical Inc., I think it was, where there was the data of some of the bank accounts that Paul Manafort had was being paid out of by people like Ivan Firstin, who was a direct lieutenant of Semyon Mogilevich. So that is really directly in the fold here for sure. And I just want to point out that in terms of Chertoff, wow. When you combine that with the Carbine 911 analysis of people like Whitney Webb and of Zev Shalev at Narrative in terms of the breakdown of who are the investors and controllers of the Carbine 911 play against the 911 system in the United States, obviously epicentered around Israeli military intelligence, but then you also have Michael Chertoff there, along with people like Peter Thiel and his Operation Palantir, another privatized, corporatized, intelligence data structure that's spread to police departments around the country. But then also Putin close oligarch Viktor Vekselberg is in the mix there. And then there was that infamous connection between Viktor Vekselberg and Andrew Intrater to Michael Cohen. So this is really a global network here, and we will link to all of this, including the document that was written apparently by Bill Taylor. The subject was Ukraine. Firtash makes his case to the U.S. government. But in our last minutes here, Greg, I wanted to read from the story that we've talked about a lot that came out last year, titled Convicted Trumputin Consigliere Paul Manafort Linked to Ohio's Stolen 2004 Election by Bob Fitrakis and Harvey Wasserman, published on September 6, 2018. Is that cool, Greg?
Yes, please do. And I'll just say real quick that this is something else that Lee Stranahan and all of his criticisms of Breitbart and the Israeli Zionist-centric coverage of Breitbart has not addressed, and that is that the articles that came out in September 2018 that Paul Manafort was using Ben Shapiro at Breitbart to write articles criticizing the Ukrainian opposition, Yulia Tymoshenko in particular, and in conjunction with the Obama-Clinton State Department as being hostile to Jews and anti-Semitic.
And also that's some of the idea of lock her up, comes out of that. As well as,
of course, one of the major claims in this, it hasn't been proven, is that Manafort was working directly with Avigdor Lieberman on this.
Via the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel. Yes, and we just need to remember too that, as similarly to the analysis of the idea of both the 9/11 and the 11/9 operations having what might call soft power components, but also intelligence components, i.e., a military component, an intelligence component, and a counterintelligence component. We need to think about that. A lot of these situations, including this Ukrainian situation, was like that, because Manafort back in 2004 in Ukraine, right? It's Yushchenko versus
Yanukovych, yes.
Right. And Yushchenko, remember, had lost apparently, but it looked like it was a frauded up election. And then also after that, then Yushchenko was then poisoned apparently by some weaponized dioxin, and to this day has a pockmarked face, I guess, because of that. So I just want to point out that there's a lot of warfare going on here. Not all of it is hot in the theater, but some of it is. Okay. So from this article, convicted Trump-Putin consigliere Paul Manafort linked to Ohio's stolen 2004 election. The infamous Trump-Putin consigliere Paul Manafort worked with the GOP operatives who stole Ohio's 2004 presidential election at the same time they teamed up to install the Kremlin's chosen mafia don in Ukraine. Manafort is Donald Trump's former campaign manager. He's been convicted of a wide range of high-profile crimes by a jury evaluating charges brought by Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller. Manafort also worked in Ukraine following the 2004 Popular Orange Revolution with Ohio-based IT specialist Michael Connell and Tennessean Jeff Averbach to install the Putin-backed Viktor Yanukovych as president of Ukraine. Connell and Averbach have been deeply implicated as being among the chief architects of the stolen Ohio 2004 vote flip that gave George W. Bush a second term in the White House. Craig Unger, in his essential book House of Trump, House of Putin, places Manafort in Ukraine in, quote, late 2004, unquote. Manafort worked out of a small 6 to 8 person office at 4 Sovievskaya Street in Kiev. Over the next decade, Manafort made 138 trips to Ukraine, according to Unger. Yanukovych's alleged 2004 quote-unquote victory was so riddled with fraud that the U.S. State Department officially condemned it. A popular uprising called the Orange Revolution forced the election results to be reversed. Okay, and aside here, I just want to say that we will further analyze all of this question about Orange Revolution, Maidan, who were the players, how organic was it, in a future show. But at the same time, I will link some articles I found from different perspectives about specifically the Maidan sniper scenario, which was obviously a provocation of some sort because it looked like a sniper, the same sniper was, or same set of snipers were shooting at both sides, activists and police. Okay, so back to the article. Quote, O'Connell died under mysterious circumstances in December 2008, but in 2010, Averbach and Manafort conspired to put the Kremlin-sponsored Yanukovych in office again. Despite widespread charges of election rigging, Yanukovych this time held power for a while. He was later overthrown by a U.S.-sponsored coup involving a far-right phalanx that included many outspoken fascists. In 2004, Averbach and Connell were key to flipping Ohio's electoral votes and thus the presidency from John Kerry to the incumbent George W. Bush. Connell was a longtime Bush family information technology specialist. Based in Akron, he co-founded the New Media Communications and GovTech IT companies. Along with Averbach's Smart Tech, they were deeply embedded in the Buckeye State's rigged 2004 election process by Bush advisor Karl Rove and Ohio Secretary of State J. Kenneth Blackwell, by the way, CMP and JINSA. From 2004 to 2014, Yanukovych's campaign team centered around Manafort, co-owner with Rick Davis of a Washington, D.C. lobbying firm, 3EDC. The company advertised on its website that it had 5, quote, strategic partners, unquote. Connell's New Media Communications was listed as one of them. Another was Averbach's AirNet Group, the parent company of SmartTech. Both Averbach and Connell were far-right anti-abortion fundamentalists. Averbach co-founded a Christian publishing house. In 2004, Blackwell gave Connell a no-bid contract to handle the backup vote count system for the state's 2004 presidential contest. Blackwell simultaneously ran the election and served as co-chair for the Ohio committee to re-elect Bush and Cheney. Connell subtracted the job with Averbach's SmartTech. After Ohio's official supercomputers went down on election night, SmartTech compiled the final tally on servers in a basement of a bank building in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Those same servers handled the email accounts for the Republican National Committee and Bush consigliere Karl Rove. Okay, so that's all we can do today, Greg, but there is a lot here for us to continue to consider. But until next week, Greg, thank you very much. Antidote, we out.
All right, thank you, Jeremy.